If you want to get more out of your science fiction and fantasy or other genre fiction you read, I think the first thing you should do is read about writing. I've got a stack of books here. I want to go through them and we can talk about why I think it's important that you learn how the writing process works in order to improve your skills as a reader. It's like a leveling up. You get a lot more out of the stuff you read as you gain a deeper understanding of the process of writing itself. The first one I'm going to talk about is $1 Million Outlines by David Farland. He wrote the Rune Lords fantasy series, and he mentored this unknown author. Maybe some of you have heard of him. His name is Brandon Sanderson. He was teaching the BYU class when Brandon went through it, you know, the same BYU class that Brandon Sanderson now teaches. And in this book, he talks about just a step-by-step guide on how to get a book outlined, how to get it ready, and then how to flesh that outline out into a complete work. I know NaNoWriMo is coming up soon, National Novel Writing Month, and a lot of people are going to be doing that. Well, this book is something that you should definitely dig into if you plan on doing that. You kind of needed to do it about 3 weeks ago because October is supposed to be the prep month, which I did not know the first few times I tried to do NaNoWriMo, and I was completely lost. That book is a really good start for the writing process itself. And these next two, okay, they're written by someone who is pretty persona non grata now for very good reasons. But we've got Characters and Viewpoint by Orson Scott Card and How to Write Science Fiction and Fantasy by Orson Scott Card. Now, you can go buy them used. He won't get any money from you, and you can still get things out of them. He has like a who's who of different writers in these two books. Characters and Viewpoint is a good way for you to understand, you know, first person limited, third person omniscient, all that goofy stuff. He also breaks down how you would write viewpoints in order to affect what the reader is experiencing. So I think it's a really good way to start building yourself a foundation for understanding why writers write some viewpoints the way they do, because it's very important. There's different books out there. They're unreliable narrators. You look at The Black Company, you're looking through the eyes of Croker. He's not being completely truthful because he's biased. He says so. And so doing something like that with your point of view character is a great way to add depth to your story. And with How to Write Science Fiction and Fantasy, I mean, it's literally How to Write Science Fiction and Fantasy from a dude who's published a crap load of books. And even in there, he talks to different authors. I mean, he's ran writing workshops forever. So these are really good, especially if you're looking into science fiction and fantasy. Speaking of science fiction and fantasy, Worlds of Wonder by David Gerrold. This is a guy that wrote the Star Trek episode, The Trouble with Tribbles. And this is just a good guide on science fiction and fantasy. He goes through, and in it, he mentions a bunch of different books that are probably worth reading, different science fiction and fantasy novels. And he talks about just a breakdown of how to make things believable, how to set the stage. He even talks about love scenes, which, I mean, some writers are better off not doing that, but, you know, it's good to have a guide. And now this one is special. This one is The Fiction Editor, the Novel, and the Novelist. And this book is amazing. It's by Thomas McCormick. He's been an editor for 28 years, and he wrote this book because he had never seen a guide for editing. There's plenty of how to write novels out there, but there's no how to edit. Editing hasn't been standardized. It's kind of each editor has their own way of doing things, and each editor is completely different. And this book really opened my eyes to the editing process and to the role an editor can have in a story, which I think is really important, because I think that with some writers, their editor can make or break how their novels come out. Changing an editor halfway through a series or something can create a tonal shift that most people won't notice, but some people will be like, what is happening? But yeah, this one's real good. Out of these first four, if you only buy one of them, I would suggest this one. It's very, very informative. Now this next one, I don't even know. I think I picked this thing up for $1. And what I really like about it, it's one of those teach yourself writing crime fiction. The author who they hide in these books or obfuscate, which is annoying. Her name is Leslie Grant Adamson. She talks about how to write crime fiction. But the really cool thing about this is at the end of almost every chapter, she has a reading list, like recommended readings. This is how I found some of the best crime fiction I've ever read. I was very surprised. It ended up being really good and very informative about different writing processes and stuff like that. It has a bunch of websites in the back, but those don't work anymore because this book's like 20 years old. Teach Yourself Writing Crime Fiction is very interesting. And these last two, these are the bangers. These are the must-owns. I cannot emphasize how much everyone who reads fiction should read these. Well, the first one, anyone who reads fiction absolutely needs to read it. The second one, that's for fantasy and science fiction nerds. But I mean, you're watching my channel, so I assume you're one of us. On Writing by Stephen King. Yes, this is a first edition hardcover. It's one of my special books. I've read this thing 3 times. Well, I've read it twice, and I've listened to the audiobook, which is also an absolute banger because it is narrated by Stephen King. And he talks about writing, but he talks about his early life and what influenced him to write. Then he has writing advice in here, and he has his own little critiques of writers and fiction itself, and it's really, really good. This book will help just about anyone become a more informed reader of fiction. I highly recommend it. It itself is just an absolute joy to read. And the end of it, it talks about his accident that almost killed him when he got hit by a van doing like 60 miles an hour. And he like died 2 or 3 times on the way to the hospital, and his recovery from that and how that changed his life. It talks about him getting sober and all that. Some of the things he talks about in here made me more excited to read some of his older fiction. He talks about how he's just absolutely coked out of his mind, and while he was writing the Tommy Knockers, which is about people being possessed by alien artifacts, and it's kind of a little what was happening to him with drugs at the time and just stuff like that. It's really, really good. I think even people who aren't fans of Stephen King would enjoy this book. It's very good. The last one, I implore anyone out there that enjoys science fiction and fantasy, you got to buy yourself a copy of this sooner than later. It hasn't been printed in almost 20 years. Every time I bring it up, no one else has read it. I don't understand. Wizardry and Wild Romance by Michael Moorcock. It is basically his treatise on epic fantasy. I mean, no one knows epic fantasy like he does, especially the origins. I mean, we're talking about one of the greatest fantasy writers of all time, and he wrote a freaking book about the genre. And it's insane the level of depth this goes to. I mean, we're talking about the absolute origins of fantasy working all the way up to now. And he gets a little ho-hum about newer stuff, but he also says he hasn't read as much of it. But he's mentioned people in interviews. He's talked about like Brandon Sanderson. He even has like a blurb for one of Brandon Sanderson's books. It's great that he has read newer stuff and still appreciates the newer stuff. But what you get out of this book is you get one of the greatest fantasy writers of all time telling you what he thinks built the genre. And so then you can use that as a list of things to read. I've read about 2/3 of the stuff that he's talked about, and holy crap, he was not wrong. And the interesting thing is, the first time you read this, if you haven't read a lot of the books on the list, you get a little out of it, but not nearly as much as if you just kind of start reading some of the things he recommends. Most of it is actually on Appendix N, which is why the second read through of this book was so rewarding, because I'd already read about 2/3 of Appendix N at that point, which includes Lord Dunsany, Lee Brackett, Frederick Brown, stuff like that. And the really nice thing is there's an index in the back, which is great because you can look through for anything you've read of that era, and chances are it's listed in the back. You can go right to the page and see why he's talking about it, what he has to say about it. He does a fantastic job of giving examples and just breaking down the craft of writing fantasy. Like I've said before, I mean, Michael Moorcock's literally one of the greatest fantasy writers of all time. The other thing I absolutely love about this is he pulls no punches when he talks about The Lord of the Rings. Now, I know that a lot of people are going to be salty about this. Yes, The Lord of the Rings is good, but I couldn't understand why I didn't feel the way everyone else did about The Lord of the Rings. And then Michael Moorcock explains it perfectly. He has an essay or an article he wrote a long time ago about it too, but basically he says he doesn't get much out of The Lord of the Rings because it's written in the same way Winnie the Pooh is. It's written like a children's book. It's just cozy. And I know a lot of people like that about The Lord of the Rings, is it's what makes them feel cozy. But that's why I just don't get it. Like, I've read them, I appreciate what they are, but I don't get it. And luckily, I found someone that feels the same way I do. Makes me feel a little better when one of the greatest fantasy writers of all time feels the same way. He's more of a sword and sorcery guy, so I think that's kind of how it goes. At this point, so am I. I've read all the good old sword and sorcery, everything that came before the Lord of the Rings that kind of established heroic fantasy, and I prefer that 9 times out of 10. These books, I think any one of them you read, it will make you a better reader. If you want to be a writer, it can't hurt to learn the craft from some of the greatest writers of all time. This book, you really, really have to get it. It's out of print. It's been out of print for 20 years. Copies are still affordable. Get this version, the updated version. There's one from like the 80s, I think, but that one doesn't have any of the updated material in the back. He does book reviews in the back of this, and it's fantastic. This was a quick video. I'm feeling a little under the weather. I hope you don't hear it in my voice, but I couldn't do the regular scheduled programming. So I just thought I'd put something out just kind of so I could talk about books. I mean, leave me a comment if you've read any of these or you're interested in any of them. I'd love to chat with you about them. If you like any of these, I've done reviews for a ton of the books that are actually mentioned in Wizardry and Wild Romance. So you should definitely check that out. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.